You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
Happy game week, Dolphins, and welcome to the 2023 Miami Dolphins regular season. It is finally here, and we are back here for another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. I do apologize for getting this show out a couple days late. If you can't tell by my voice, a little under the weather, and the entire family was a little bit under the weather over the weekend. 2 sick kiddos, so no fun here, but hopefully we're all coming out of that onto the better side as we root on our beloved Miami Dolphins into the regular season. Now, we've got a packed show for tonight. Going to give my thoughts on the 53-man roster and practice squad, and then we'll do an in-depth preview of Sunday's matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers. And I already know I'm going to slip up and call them the San Diego Chargers at some point, so just expect it at this point in the podcast. Other than having sick kids in a sick household, not much new other than my beloved Arsenal in the Premier League knocking off Manchester United 3-1 the other day. Big victory, and somehow, someway, just when the 10 count is about to be applied, the Cincinnati Reds go on a little mini streak and find themselves back in contention for the wild card. The only cool thing, and I'll be at their game this coming Saturday, is that they have their infield of the future up. Noelvi Marte, Ellie De La Cruz, Spencer Steer, and Chris Encarnacion Strand. Like, those are, other than Steer, those are the three top Reds prospects that they have in the farm system. They are all up in the bigs right now, still clinging to life in the wild card hopes in the massive NL wild card race. But that's not what you're here for. You're here for Miami Dolphins football. And first, before we get into that, I know I promised I would do the Lagavulin 11 Offerman, the Charred Cask edition. Don't have my sense of smell complete. I'm pretty stuffed up. So we're going to withhold that, and that'll be our drink for Sunday night if they do, in fact, beat the Chargers. Right now, though, I do have a small little dram of the Port Charlotte heavily peated from Brooklotic Distillery in Isla Scotch. Brooklotic is kind of famous for being the one Isla distillery that doesn't peat their normal expressions. This is a special one that they did. It's a nice, easy drinking Isla Scotch, not too big and bold. Still gives you the heavy peat flavor. A good one to transition to if you're coming from a background of like Spaysides or from the bourbon. This one won't overpower you the way most of the other Isla Scotches will, despite the name being heavily peated. Take our little quick sip right there. So that's a good one. On a scale of 5 stars, I would probably give that one a 4.1, 4.2, somewhere around there. Like I said, nice, easy drinking one. A little bit of a burn on the taste, but you don't get the peat. It would be higher for me if there was a little more peat flavor that lasts with it, but that's still a good one to get started with. So we'll dive right into it with my outlook on the Dolphins 53-man roster and practice squad. So just some general thoughts as we begin looking at the Dolphins' initial 53-man roster for the 2023 season overall. And I think we've said this the last 3 seasons now. In my mind, this is the most talented roster we've had since 2002, yet again. This year's team, I think, has a lot of strong points. There's a few landmines that you're going to have to navigate, and we'll get into those. So let's look at offense first. Well, first let's do the specialists and knock those out of the way. That one was pretty much chalk. Jason Sanders is your kicker. Jake Bailey's the punter, and Blake Ferguson is the long snapper. Offensively, at quarterback, they kept the 3 that we thought. Tua Tagovailoa. Mike White was named the backup today by Mike McDaniel. This is Monday night as you're listening. And then Skylar Thompson is the third quarterback. which is now eligible to be the emergency guy per the new NFL rule, which is really just kind of the old NFL rule brought back. I feel like Mike White won the backup job just kind of by default because of the money you're paying him. This is one of the spots where, put Tua aside for a moment, this is one of the spots, backup quarterback, where I feel like Miami has a bit of a landmine compared to other positions on the team. Obviously, when Tua Tagovailoa is playing at the top of his game, it's at or near MVP caliber level. We saw that last year. The question was, and likely always will be, his injuries, and not just concussions, injuries in general. He's had ankle issues, he's had a broken finger, he's had the rib injury with the lung, all throughout his career. Now, if you miss Tua for, let's call it 3 games max, I still think you can navigate through this season and put together a playoff run. It's going to be tough in the AFC this year because it's absolutely loaded, but I think if you miss Tua for 3 games or fewer, you're probably still in a pretty good spot. If you miss him for longer than that, especially if those games are consecutive, that's when I think the Dolphins get into big trouble, because there's really not a whole lot there that we've seen so far from Mike White that suggests he's better than Teddy Bridgewater. He's had a few nice games in the NFL. He showed some toughness. If you've watched the Jets-Bills game last year where he got taken off and just obliterated a couple of times on big shots and came back on. But it's kind of the run-of-the-mill backup quarterback play. And then Skylar Thompson is a gamer in the most general sense of the word, where he's not a good practice player. I think he does better when things are out of structure. So if something does befall Tua and he's out for more than 3 games, you might not be getting to that life preserver. You know what I mean? The running back room, we already saw Jeff Wilson get put on IR, so there's 4 guys for now: Raheem Mostert, Savon Ahmed, Devon Achane, and the undrafted rookie Chris Brooks. I think that's a good mix of talent, especially if you can, if Ahmed and Achane are healthy. I think I saw in the injury report Achane is questionable for Sunday's game against the Chargers. It sounds like he's tracking to play because they don't have the probable designation anymore. I like that room. I like the skill sets. I like the versatility. I like that you finally have a big back in Chris Brooks who might be able to get some short yardage and low red zone stuff. Obviously, they've got Alec Ingold as a fullback. The receiver room went pretty much as I thought, except they added a 6th guy in River Craycraft. So you had Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Eric Ezukama, Braxton Berrios, Cedric Wilson Jr. I believe those were the 5 that I thought would make it. And then River Craycraft was the 6th, who also plays a good deal on special teams. The tight end room was wide open. Durham Smythe, Tyler Kroft, I thought those 2 guys deserved it. Smythe was kind of the chalk pick. Kroft, I thought, blocked well enough in the preseason to earn a spot. And then undrafted free agent Julian Hill out of Campbell University in North Carolina got the 3rd spot. I like that just because he can play as a Y tight end or as an F tight end. He's not a project type like Elijah Higgins and Tanner Conner were. He's more of a true tight end, which is what I think you need in this offense. But that's a pretty big jump going from Campbell University to regular season NFL. We'll see how that goes. The offensive line, the starters, sounds like they're going to be chalk at this point with Teron Armstead, Isaiah Wynn, Connor Williams, Robert Hunt, and Austin Jackson. Austin Jackson is kind of the one, just in terms of play quality, is the one guy on offense that may sink the ship a few times if he's not up to par. And then obviously Teron Armstead with the injuries. I would imagine he's out there for week 1 just based on some of the reports that I've been given from people more in the know than myself. I would imagine he's out there. So you like that line to an extent, 1 through 5, or left tackle to right tackle, I think. And then the depth pieces you have Liam Eichenberg, Lester Cotton, Kendall Lamb, and Keon Smith. You'd feel better, obviously, if you had Robert Jones, but he's on IR, probably eligible to come back after that Bills game in week 4. Solid depth there. Defensively, we'll call the interior players pretty much chalk. Christian Wilkins, Zach Sealer, Raekwon Davis, Emmanuel Ogbah, if you want to lump him in, and then undrafted free agent Brandon Pilley. That was kind of one of the three undrafted surprises that we got. I thought Pilley kind of earned it based on what he did in the preseason versus any other of the young interior linemen they had on the roster. We'll touch on the practice squad guys in a moment, but I think getting Pilley to the roster in week 1 is maybe more of a roster mechanism than him actually being the true backup nose tackle. Your edge guys, they kept 4 instead of 5. Malik Reed was kind of the one surprise cut to me. I thought they would keep him. I thought his versatility as a pass rusher would be something that Fangio would look for. But obviously you've got Jalen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, Emmanuel Ogbah, and Andrew Van Ginkel. Didn't keep any of the young guys around, which, other than Garrett Nelson, I'm probably in the minority, but that didn't surprise me a whole lot. There's just not much developmental stuff for them to go off of based on the preseason, the actual games. And I think Andrew Van Ginkel, you're probably not going to see him as an inside linebacker as much as maybe some people originally thought, just because of Channing Tindall's development. I think there will certainly be situational plays where you put Van Ginkel there, short yardage situations, some low red zone situations, goal to go scenarios, that type of thing. But I think he's better served as being an edge defender. Off-ball guys, David Long and Jerome Baker, your starters. Channing Tindall and Duke Riley, the backups. Corners, they kept 7. So obviously Jalen Ramsey, 2 injured reserve. Keon Crossan, 2 injured reserve, out for the season. And then Nick Needham still on the PUP. So the guys that they've got, Xavier Howard, Kader Kohu, Eli Apple, that would be my guess for the top 3 guys come this Sunday. Then you have Cam Smith, Kelvin Joseph, who came over in a trade from the Cowboys, who's more of a nickel type and special teams type of guy. Justin Bethel, who's a special teams guy, and then Perry Nickerson, who showed pretty well in the opportunities he got on defense and was certainly a force on special teams in the preseason, earned a spot. And then safeties, Javon Holland, Deshaun Elliott, Brandon Jones, Elijah Campbell, and Verone McKinley. Safety is kind of the one red flag spot for me, kind of the way backup quarterback was on offense. Safety is it for me on defense. Obviously, you have Javon Holland. I think he'll be a star in this system. I think Deshaun Elliott is above average for this system, maybe trending more toward good. Brandon Jones, if healthy, and we'll talk about this role when we preview the Chargers, I think has some very niche capabilities that'll fit, but we didn't see him at all in the preseason. What's his level of play going to be like coming in cold, relatively speaking, week 1? Elijah Campbell's on the injury report for week 1, so we don't know about his status. And then Verone McKinley, to me, is more of a special teams guy, maybe does some coverage stuff, but he doesn't strike me as the type of guy who's going to be able to run the alley and come up and support the run the way that you would want a safety to do so in this defense. But above all, I think the 53 is strong. I think there are some very strong groups. Wide receiver, I like the edge players, the interior line players, and the off-ball guys a lot more than most people. I think cornerback depth is way more strong than it was a year ago. I brought this example up time and time again. You look at a team like Cincinnati last year. You lost Chidobe Awuzie for the season on Halloween on that Monday night game up in Cleveland. They had drafted Cam Taylor-Britt in the 2nd round, inserted him into the lineup, and carried on, business as usual and made it to the AFC title game. Miami now has that same luxury where you've got a kid like Cam Smith who probably not going to start right away, but has a lot of talent and could come in and play for you. You still have Nick Needham waiting in the wings. You have Jalen Ramsey that you're going to get sometime November, December most likely. So you've got a lot of depth options. Now, looking at the practice squad, I thought the Dolphins made some clever signings here, especially on the defensive side, getting some proven players. So offensively, you have Darrington Evans, who's kind of a smaller, shifty back to be the fifth running back for the moment. They did sign Robbie Chosen today back to the practice squad, so you have him, Braylon Sanders, who's still not quite 100%, and then Raleigh Webb coming over from, I believe, the Patriots camp. He was with the Ravens in the past as another receiver. You have two tight ends on the practice squad, Tanner Connor. They are seemingly not ready to give up on that project just yet. Still waiting for any kind of result from that. And then Nick Bowers, who's a big blocking tight end, 6'4", 260. Sounds like insurance if something happens to Smythe or Croft early in the year. Unfortunately, they weren't able to get Ryan Hayes, the tackle, back on the practice squad. They've got James Tunstall, the undrafted free agent, who needs a lot of work. Chasen Hines comes over from the Patriots as a guard. That might actually be an intriguing option for depth once he picks up the system. And then Alama Uluave, who was on the team as an undrafted free agent, showed good mobility, just isn't strong enough at the point of attack yet. He got knocked back way too easily, far too often in the preseason against backups. You can see the talent there, the potential's there, but he has to get stronger. So a lot of developmental guys on the offensive side. You've got some proven playability with Darrington Evans, Robbie Chosen, and to a lesser extent Braylon Sanders when healthy. But the rest of those guys are clearly developmental guys. On defense, however, up front you brought back Deshaun Hand, and I do wonder if this is a roster mechanism where maybe you don't have him on the roster week 1 so as not to guarantee his salary, because he does have quite an extensive injury history, but maybe you add him to the roster in week 2 in some capacity. Same goes for Rashard Lawrence, who was a starting nose tackle for the Arizona Cardinals a year ago. He's not going to give you much in terms of a pass rush. You know, he's built like a fire hydrant, 6'2", 310. He's stout. Played at LSU, has some nice play strength to him. Probably a better fit as a true nose in this system, at least right now, than Brandon Pilley is. So again, you've got two very experienced guys on the practice squad that can step up into those backup D-line roles. So I wonder if there's a roster mechanism move coming as it relates to Brandon Pilley and then those two guys that are on the practice squad for the moment. You have two outside linebacker types. You have Cameron Good, who showed well on special teams. I don't know that he's ever going to be anything more than a special teams player at the NFL level, but knows the system. Good player to have as a special teams athlete in your back pocket. Chase Winovich was signed to the practice squad. Spent last year in Cleveland. Prototypical 3-4 edge type of player. I remember talking about him when he came out in the draft. He got absolutely dominated by former Dolphins pick Isaiah Prince at Ohio State when Winovich was in his last year at Michigan, and it kind of eliminated any notion of him ever being a pure pass rush type of guy. But if you need another Andrew Van Ginkel type who can set the edge, who can play the run, who can do some things in coverage, who can get cleanup sacks off secondary rushes, that's a good player to have in that capacity with Winovich. Inside linebacker, they signed A.J. Johnson, now going by Alexander Johnson, which is what he went by in college at Tennessee. He played for Vic Fangio in Denver, I think at least 2 of the years that Fangio was there. Big, strong guy, 6'2", 255. Not real athletic, but he's going to tackle anything that moves B-gap to B-gap. And unlike Elandon Roberts, is a little more instinctual in coverage despite not being all that mobile. Knows how to play in the defense, and that relates to something we'll talk about in the game preview. And then in the secondary, Ethan Bonner was kept, the undrafted free agent out of Stanford, and they added safety Josh Kalu, who I believe, I forget who he was in the league with, Carolina, I believe. So the practice squad on the defensive side, you've got some proven depth pieces, especially in the front 7. if things start to get a little rocky early on in the season. Now, as it relates to the preview of the Los Angeles Chargers, obviously that game 4:25 Eastern Time on CBS coming up this Sunday from SoFi Stadium. Gives you a rematch of a game last year. You look at the overall series, the Dolphins and Tua beat the Chargers, and both Tua and Herbert's rookie season. That was the COVID year in 2020. The Dolphins won that game. I believe it was 29-21. And then obviously last year the Chargers victorious 23-17 on Sunday Night Football, where the Dolphins just couldn't get anything going offensively other than Tyreek Hill on the fumble-rooski and then Tyreek Hill on the bomb pass from Tua. That was about it. So you look at this from the Dolphins' offensive perspective. I think this is a great litmus test for Mike McDaniel and Tua. You know, the Chargers were one of the only teams that pressed, along with trying to pack the middle. And despite being ranked, I think they were 31st in the league at the time against the run, they held Miami's ground game in check pretty well that night, and they were missing Joey Bosa, missing Joey Bosa. I think Sebastian Joseph Day, their nose tackle, was also out. But they limited Raheem Mostert to just 37 yards on 11 carries. Miami had 19 carries for 92 yards on the night, a 4.8 yards per carry average, but a lot of that was bolstered by 3 scrambles by Tua Tagovailoa, netting 28 yards. Certainly should have been a lot more productive from Miami's end. This is the test, I think, for this Sunday is can you counter what the Chargers are doing? Now, obviously, Ronaldo Hill was the Chargers defensive coordinator for that game. He is now in-house for the Dolphins as the passing defensive coordinator, the pass game coordinator for Vic Fangio. So we'll see how much of that plan was Brandon Staley's versus how much was Ronaldo Hill's. But this is a great opportunity to see counter punches. We know that Tua worked a lot in the offseason on outbreaking routes, especially deeper down the field. Last year he had a great sense of hitting those like 15 to 20 yard intermediate passes over the middle. Now I think the test is, can you hit those same passes towards the outside of the numbers? You know, so that's a longer throw, you know, going across the field more rather than straight up the middle. So that'll be a nice litmus test. I think one other thing to keep note of is how can you get guys like Hill and Waddle opportunities from the slot where they're not covered by those outside corners that the Chargers have. Asante Samuel Jr., who's the other one? Davis from last year, number 43, had a hell of a game. And then we also didn't have to face Derwin James in the secondary in that ball game, if I remember correctly. So how do you get more, you know, open towards the sideline, and is Tua able to hit that? And then can you get the run game going? It certainly seemed like Miami made a concerted effort to do just that in the preseason. Can you do that against the Chargers, especially if they have their full front together? The screen game, I think, is something that Miami worked on, not always having the greatest of success in the preseason, especially when trying to throw that little tight end screen to Durham Smythe. But I think that's a good way to get guys in space, especially if you have speedy backs like Mostert, A-Chain, Ahmed. Even Chris Brooks looked pretty good with the ball in his handoff receptions. That's one way to counter this defense, especially if they're going to be playing ultra deep with the safeties to counter the speed of Hill and Waddle that you have. So what counters can Mike McDaniel come up with? Can you just bludgeon them to death and run the ball 40 times if you have to? Is that the key to success this weekend against the Chargers? Or if you're forced to throw it a lot, can you not rely on having passes over the middle? You know, clearly whatever the Chargers game plan was, they executed it very, very well. Now, that was also kind of a landmine game where you had your second straight game out on the West Coast. I believe the Dolphins stayed in California having played the 49ers the week before. So, it's one of those landmine schedule things, and I'm actually going to be on Finside the NFL tomorrow night, Tuesday night, talking with a panel of Dolphins internet cognoscenti, as it were, going through our game-by-game predictions. So if you want that from me, you'll have to tune into that show. I'm not going to go into that here. I hate doing game-by-game predictions just because there's so much variable change and so much volatility from week to week. You just don't know what you're going to get. And even the simplest lineup change can affect a lot of things. Defensively, and I'll admit there's a little bit more meat on the bone here with this preview just for some resources that I found. So let's dive into a couple things here. First of all, we all know that Vic Fangio was the head coach of the Denver Broncos, played against Justin Herbert 4 times during their time as division rivals. So Herbert drafted in 2020, missed Fangio's first year in Denver. I'm going to pull up our resources here. So they faced each other 4 separate times, and in those performances, Justin Herbert's average game went like this. He was 25 for 38 in terms of passing, which is a 67% completion percentage, so right about 2/3 of his passes. Averaged 268 yards per game, give or take a little bit here on the percentage, but 7.1 yards per attempt with 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. So if you can get that again on Sunday, I feel like Miami ought to have a chance to win. Now, just for reference sake, we know the Dolphins and Chargers played last year. In that game, Herbert was 39 for 51, so it's a 76 completion percentage, 367 yards, a 7.2 yards per attempt with 1 touchdown, no turnovers. Believe Miami sacked him at least twice. I know Christian Wilkins had one, I think 3 times. Phillips, Wilkins, and Ronaldo Hill, and then there was the bullshit penalty on Jalen Phillips that wiped out a 4th. Going back, you look at the games that Fangio and Herbert faced off. His rookie year, Denver won the first game in Denver 31-30. The Chargers won the second game in LA 19-16. So both of those games were pretty close. You had one game where you gave up 30 points, one game where you held them under 20. The second year, the Broncos won in Denver 28-13, and then the Chargers exploded in LA at the end of the year 34-13, and that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for Vic's time in Denver. So a little bit of a mixed bag. You have a win where you gave up 30 points, and you have a loss where you gave up just 19. So interesting there. And then you also look at the 2 wins. Herbert did not turn the ball over at all. In the 2 games that they lost, he threw a combined 4 interceptions. So multiple turnovers in the 2 losses, no turnovers in the 2 wins for the Chargers. Now, another resource that we have for this one, and I'm going to give a shout out here. If you don't follow him already, his name is Chris Vasseur, goes by Coach Vass, V-A-S-S on Twitter. Follow him, and he will do some YouTube channel stuff on the Coach Vass YouTube channel. Last year, he did a breakdown of a game from 2021, which was the Broncos versus the Cowboys. Now, why does this pertain to the Dolphins versus Chargers matchup? Let me explain. The Cowboys offensive coordinator in that game was Kellen Moore, who is now the offensive coordinator for the Chargers. And obviously Vic Fangio was the head coach of the Broncos. We're going to see that offensive system versus Vic Fangio's defensive system. Now, for some context, Denver at the time was 4-4, went to Dallas and beat the Cowboys pretty easily, 30-16. There was a late score by Dallas to make it look a little better than it was, but it was an ass kicking. And Denver did that. Their two off-ball linebacker starters for that year were Josie Jewell and A.J. Johnson, who I referenced earlier. Both of them were out with injuries for that game. Their two starting linebackers were Kenny Young, who had played for 1 week, and I believe the other one was Alex Singleton. If not Singleton, I'll have to get the name. The other starter got signed that week, had not played with the team, had not practiced with them until the week of the game. So you basically got two guys with 1 game's worth of experience in that defense playing the Dallas Cowboys. That's CeeDee Lamb, that's Michael Gallup, that's Cedric Wilson Jr., that's Zeke Elliott. I believe the only major name Dallas was missing on offense was Tyron Smith at left tackle that day. So an impressive road win for the Denver Broncos. Now, if you look at that game, and Coach Vass breaks this down on his YouTube, does it by coverage, you actually see a lot of cover 1 lurk. And like we've said, Fangio's defense isn't all zone stuff. There is man-to-man that is played. You have the quarter stuff, which is cover 6 and cover 8. We've gone over that plenty. They've done the cover 3 match stuff, which is kind of Fangio's change-up. The cover 3 fire zone stuff. This is where I was talking about or referring to Brandon Jones earlier. So you look at Denver's defense. I believe that's Caden Stearns, who was a rookie, maybe a rookie that year. I can't remember which year Stearns was drafted. But he's essentially like a hybrid safety / slot player. And he's often the guy blitzing in these fire zones where you're basically sending 4, you're dropping someone back, and you're sending 1. So there's very, very seldom an extra rusher. You're just sending a rusher from somewhere that you wouldn't normally expect that rusher coming from. In that game, you also see Tampa 2 being called, which is dropping 8 guys into coverage for them, so a 3-man rush. That is the quintessential principle, and I'm not sorry to dive down another rabbit hole, but that is what the Cincinnati Bengals have done to the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes the last few times they've played, is the drop 8. Just force him to take checkdowns and shorten the throws and not get beat on the crazy plays. Kind of the same philosophy you're going to see with Justin Herbert here. And then there was cover 1 stuff in the low red zone and in goal line situations. So what I would say about this matchup, and you can go back and watch it, it's like a 3-hour breakdown. It's excellent, excellent work from Coach Vass, and I forget the Denver Broncos guy, Cody something, but he and Cody had a pretty nice back and forth during that game. But Coach Vass basically highlights Denver doesn't really blitz a lot. And when they do blitz, they're not overload blitzing like Rex Ryan. They're not doing 0 blitzes like Brian Flores and Josh Boyer. It's fire zone stuff. Or they're running a blitz with an inside linebacker. Denver won the game up front with their front 4. I haven't gone back to look at the roster. I know Jonathan Cooper, who was like a 7th-round rookie, is one of the guys that they had. I believe Shelby Harris was still there at the time. I'd have to go and look up the other. Baron Browning maybe was one of them. I'd have to look at the names to tell you who they had. Denver really only had 2 mistakes in coverage. And one of them, they got lucky because Dak missed it, but it was a backside dig route where the safety stayed over the top and the other safety was taken deep down the field. So you basically had a big void in the middle of the field, but someone got some pressure on Dak and forced him to try and take a check down out of the pocket. And then the other one was just a blown coverage. Looked like a miscommunication where it looked like the coverage should have been shifted and wasn't. But what you see a lot of is in that game, and I suspect we'll see it on Sunday, is Dallas, at the time, still had Zeke Elliott before a lot of the injury issues and the breakdown started to occur. So Dallas is running a lot of 12 and 21 personnel stuff. And Denver is basically living in the 4-2-5 nickel, where you've got your 2 edge players standing up. So call it a 2-4-5 if you want. But they basically live in this nickel against 12 and 21 personnel. And what Coach Vass points out is that in this coverage, or against these personnel groupings, the current trend in the NFL, and even in college football, where this started with Alabama and Georgia, is to run creepers or simulated pressures against these base personnel groups, where you show like you're going to blitz and then don't, trying to get them to max protect and have an extra guy stay in. Fangio kind of bucks this trend, and he actually runs fire zones into it. And you see this a couple times where having two brand spanking new out-of-the-box off-ball linebackers, essentially, the Denver linebackers don't run fit very well. And a lot of times there's sort of a hero tackle by Caden Stearns or Justin Simmons, or I think Bradley Roby was their other nickel at the time, to basically save them from, big-time gains happening in the ground. So one advantage I think the Dolphins are going to have is you have a much better front four. And ideally, the lineup you're going to see most is Chubb, Sealer, Wilkins, and Phillips. That front four is way better than anything that Denver put on the field that day. And you also have a much better run fitter in David Long, who played in the same defense structure last year in Tennessee, because Tennessee was running wide 9 shit out of the 2-4-5 personnel grouping. So you're not going to have, these putz linebackers just kind of running into blocks or overrunning their fit points. You're going to be better against the run. And one of the things that Denver did to really, really mess up Kellen Moore's run game, because Dallas at that time tried to run a lot of counter stuff, is they slanted their D-line. So sometimes you guess right and you slant into the run, which helps. But if you slant wrong, Fangio's always had his linebackers fit the backside. Now that's kind of a standard rule from high school football on up. If you slant your line, your backers fit away. Denver's linebackers in that game didn't always do that, which is where some of those hero tackles from Stearns and Simmons and the like kind of came into play. So I think Miami's got an advantage where, and ironically, I believe Caden Stearns also played at Texas. So you've got Brandon Jones, who can be that sort of nickel fire zone blitz type. We already know he's good at it, just from the previous defenses we've had in Miami. We know that Miami's got a beefed up front. They should have much better secondary awareness, which is key, because I think the Chargers offense, especially the wide receiver core, is better than what Denver went against versus Dallas that day. I think the trio of Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and who's the rookie from TCU, Quentin Johnson, are better than what the Cowboys had to throw out there. I also think Justin Herbert, bigger arm than Dak, plays better within structure than Dak at times. So the key is going to be, can you get pressure on Herbert? Now you look at the game last year, Rashawn Slater was already out for the season, and I believe they were missing a right guard, Zion Johnson, that night, or right tackle was brand new, something like that. You don't really have those advantages this week unless something happens between now and the game. So you're going to have to figure out ways to pressure Herbert and ways not to give up those big plays, which remember last year, I remember Xavier Howard gave up one deep one. I think Kader Kohu gave up a deep one or had a couple penalties in that game for PI on deeper throws. You can't give them free yardage. And that's sort of the bedrock philosophy of this defense. The overarching principle is you don't give up big plays. You're putting that circus tent over the top of the defense to not get beat deep. Make Herbert check it down 15 times on a drive. And if he checks it down, to Eckler or whomever, and they beat you that way, okay, tip your cap. Don't give up the easy throws. That's the key to this one. Don't give up the big throws or the easy throws down the field. Make them take the checkdowns. And I think if you get that line, which was Herbert having about a 2/3 completion percentage, 268 yards, 7 yards a throw. If you can lower that a little, I would take 2 touchdowns and an interception and feel pretty good about Miami's odds of winning the game if you can make that line stand. So for me, that's kind of the benchmark. If you can get Herbert to that average or not much of a deviation higher than that average based on those 4 games, which were Denver versus the Chargers with Fangio at the controls, if you can hit that metric, I think you've got a good chance to win this ball game. Now, some of the other things to note from that game, one of the oddities that you see, and this was something that we didn't see a ton of from Flores and Boyer that you see from Fangio, and this may have been a game plan specific thing for Dallas, is they blitzed a lot on 1st and 2nd down versus blitzing on 3rd down. Now, let me be clear. They don't blitz a lot overall, but when they do, it's earlier in your down and distance sequence than 3rd down a lot of the time. On 3rd down, they're playing a lot of zone coverage to rally up and make tackles versus being ultra aggressive and playing cover 1 or cover 0. I think that'll be a welcome change to most Dolphins fans, and I think if you do it strategically, you can see some of those blitzes work with guys like Brandon Jones. Wouldn't surprise me to see Javon Holland do it. Wouldn't surprise me to see Kader Kohou do it. And then eventually when we get him back, Jalen Ramsey. That was one of the things that Raheem Morris, who learned this defense from Brandon Staley, who learned it from Vic Fangio, did in LA. They had Ramsey act as basically a dime backer. They acted him as a spy, as an overhang player who blitzed from the slot. You're going to have a couple of bodies who can do that kind of stuff. So just some things to keep in mind for Sunday's game. You know, if you can keep Herbert to that stat line, I think Miami's defense will be good enough against the run, you know, preseason game against Jacksonville notwithstanding, good enough against the run to give you that opportunity to win the game. I feel like this will be a close game. I feel like the offense needs to play a pretty clean game, especially given what last year was. And, you know, I've listened to some of the talking points that Mike McDaniel gave. He certainly seems a little bit more fired up about this than some of the other games we've heard him preview in the past. So maybe a little bit of added salt there from Coach McDaniel, which in my eyes is a good thing. You know, if you had a bad night and gotten embarrassed on national television, you want to come back and kind of answer that bell. So there you have it. I think for me, if you can keep the Chargers at 20 points or less, the Dolphins win the game. That's kind of the ultimate benchmark for me. Now, that's going to do it for this show. We'll have a recap episode out probably Monday or Tuesday next week, recapping the Chargers game on Sunday. I will do my best to get that out Monday. But it could be Tuesday as well, just given some scheduling conflicts. But again, please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify. Leave a rating, leave a review. Feel free to reach out and ask me any questions, or if there's anything you want talked about on the show. Next week's episode, again, like we said, we'll do the recap, and then we'll do a preview of the Week 2 opponent, the New England Patriots, which will be on Sunday Night Football. That is it for me. Fins up. Have a great week, everybody. Let's hope we can start the season off on the right note on Sunday. Thank you, and enjoy your week.